Greetings. Welcome to Dr. Neil's Spiritual Awakening to Non-Duality. This is Dr. Connie Zweig, and I'll be interviewing my husband who lives in spiritual awakening. You may have heard about this or read about it, but you may not know someone who lives it day to day. We'll be exploring how non-duality developed in Dr. Neil as I've observed it over 25 years, and as he directly experiences it every day. Each podcast will explore a different theme. We look forward to you joining us. Greetings. Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to explore how consciousness woke up Dr. Neil, his personal journey from a young age to today, in terms of his evolution of consciousness. And it's a little bit different perspective from other people who've woken up. And one of the points that we're sharing is that everyone's journey is unique. So this may not be your journey, but it's Dr. Neil's, and we want to offer it as an archetypal example of becoming a fulfilled human being. Okay, Dr. Neil.
Well, I remember one of my first teachers, Dr. Neat, was a healer, who said to me that there was not enough time to do the spiritual journey on the Western path. And that was actually his story, not mine, because mine was a different story. So I remember in the previous lifetime, as I've shared before, being a Brahmin priest in a Hindu temple, a Shiva temple, having 2 wives and a bunch of kids, and doing a lot of chanting and meditating and spiritual practice, and focused attention on waking up, particularly in the last 10 years of my life there, and waking up to consciousness, and having consciousness wake me up to myself. The distinction, the importance of that journey was that it was part of a tradition, fairly dogmatic, structured tradition that built an ego that was isolated and somewhat distinct, like most religions. They build a sense of body, emotion, thought, imagination, heart that is very solid, that is very traditional. And that was my experience in that lifetime. And in terms of chakras, I moved from the 3rd chakra to the 7th. I skipped out the 4th, the heart, the planetary chakra, the psychic, celestial, and moved straight from a sense of ego to a sense of being and consciousness. As a result, when I died in that lifetime, I remember going straight to Brahmaloka, the divine place of bliss, well-being, and not getting stuck anywhere in the process, which was the traditional idea of waking up in the East. And yet, the truth was, there was no growth in that waking up state. There was bliss, there was well-being, there was joy, there was a sense of connection with all the beings there, but there was no
continuing evolution.
So ultimately, I became bored, or some part of me, and recognized that I needed to go back and have a human life that involved waking up the other chakras, the 4th, 5th, 6th chakras, as well as stabilizing the base chakras. So I recognized that and took the journey back through the layers of consciousness into a body, into my mother's womb, and chose her particularly because she was driven, goal-oriented, and would keep me on my feet and growing. which was not where I was. I was not growing. So this was her particular gift to me, as well as love. She was very loving. So I entered the body, and I guess the thing that Connie said was, rather than me waking up to something, something woke me up. Consciousness unfolded inside of me. So what I've discovered is that the soul, which is not Atman, which is eternal and evolving and growing, is has been present in this lifetime from the beginning. In fact, before this lifetime, and has been involved with the psychology and the body and the emotions and the thoughts and guiding this being, as well as various spiritual masters have been guiding this being as it's unfolded throughout the life cycle. And I guess what I'm trying to share in this podcast is the human journey, the journey through different stages of human development that doesn't necessarily require intense spiritual practice, particularly in the early years, but is part of the human evolution. So being in a body and exercising and playing sports grounded me, and many other practices were body-centered and were helped me identify with the physical body, because I was kind of tripped out before I came here, and the emotional world, and the mental world, and the heart level. So how did that happen? That happened because the experiences of this life that were created for being, for consciousness, were all about living well, eating a healthy diet, exercising, good food, good attitude, and a lot of training in healthy ways of living. Becoming a psychologist, which opened up the heart and the throat chakras and kept them open, which helped me to be other-centered and caring for others rather than just myself, and caring for humanity and the planet.
So let's move to your early spiritual practices.
Mm-hmm.
So you first were drawn to Jewish mysticism.
Yeah, I was raised as a Jew. What did that mean? That meant that my parents, who were not religious in any way, but believed in human kindness and service and caring, sent me to Jewish day school, after school, in order to learn how to be a good Jew and do a bar mitzvah, which is the 13-year-old ceremony of one becoming a spiritual being in the Jewish tradition. So that struck me deeply, and I went way beyond my parents in that tradition. So became religious, went to yeshivas, which are Jewish graduate schools, and studied Jewish mysticism, and had a great deal of joy in singing and dancing and celebrating the Jewish traditions.
So in Jewish mysticism, you found some practices, and yet you kind of got in trouble there.
No, I didn't get in trouble there. I just, at some point, woke up to the fact that I was not truly believing in the dogma, the laws. In Judaism, there's a lot of rules about behavior. They say there's 613 of them. So it's a very behavioral-oriented tradition. And I remember when I was well, in my early 20s, I had an epiphany. I was lying in bed on a Friday night, and the laws in Judaism are that you're not allowed to switch on the lights because it's an action of work, and you're supposed to rest on the seventh day of the Sabbath. And I wanted to read a book, and I was in conflict about it. And I looked at myself and saw that what held me back from switching on the light was not my belief or my faith, was my sense of belonging, this tribal. And at that moment, I had shifted to a more independent person and let go of all my trappings. And within weeks, I was free from the Jewish perspective.
And then you met a teacher, I think he was a homeopath, right?
He was a teacher on the journey. I was meditating 5 hours a day at that point, trying to get back to Brahmaloka, which was a big mistake, but I didn't know that at the time. And I was guided to meet this teacher who was very spiritually advanced, and he would talk to my soul, like soul to soul. And still now, sometimes I remember what he said, and it applies to the moment, not where I was. So he was somewhat of a guide, and there were other guides spiritually at the time, but he directed me back into my body more. So eating meat, exercise, having sex, having intimacy, getting married, having children. So the householder path. And so I spent the next 20 years deeply invested in that. There were spiritual teachers, but nothing significant in the sense that it was life-changing. That happened later on. I knew from Jewish mysticism that at 49, he embarked on an inner journey. That was the time to do. So I postponed that to be part of development until then.
And so what happened after this guide? Were you doing TM after him?
Yeah, I was doing transcendental meditation, the cities, and which are the advanced practices, and too much of them. But it was actually before him.
Oh, that was before.
Yeah, because those were making me sick, because it was not my dharma, my path, to actually be transcendent, to go back and do that same journey again.
And so then you got married and had kids.
Yep.
And you immigrated from South Africa to Los Angeles.
Yeah, which was an important move.
And then what unfolded?
Well, what unfolded was living a householder path, which was service and love for my wife. There was a great love between us, and I was very forgiving and understanding. It was a really deep development of compassion and kindness and forgiveness.
So your marriage became the teacher for a while.
Marriage became a teacher for many years, and being a psychologist, which is a very broad field. I was an organizational psychologist, a clinical psychologist. Was immense training on stilling the mind and the body and the ego and being there for someone else. And eventually finding that I could actually feel God in the other person teaching me at the same time as I was being a therapist for them.
So we go into that at length in the podcast on being a psychotherapist as a spiritual practice.
Right. That was definitely a very important part of the spiritual practice. Not so much in terms of the transcendent spirituality, being consciousness, bliss, but much more in terms of the heart and the planet, much more in terms of caring, compassion, and empathy, and understanding, and training not to be centered in my feelings. And even the marriage with Connie, the first few years was a deep training on being present with my own feelings and learning how to be reflective rather than expressive, not turning them against myself, but not turning them against her, and learning to be present with the emotional world.
So you ended up divorced from your first wife and met me. And in our past 25 years, we've met a number of teachers who have guided you.
Yes, correct.
So I think maybe first was the man in the TM world and the satsang.
There was a community of people, sangha or satsang, who were conscious beings who, listening to them and being present with them, helped me to learn about transcendence again.
Well, it helped you to claim the level of consciousness that you were already experiencing as it was reflected in other people's evolution.
Yes, I think Dr. Neat taught me how to connect with the knower, or knowing, if we want to see it as a verb, which is the nature of divinity, which is, in religious terms, one might say God knows everything. God is omniscient. But in conscious terms, it means that there's a level of awareness which everything is known. And there were techniques to connect with that I learned from him, observing him, because that's what he was doing. And it was almost like I took it in. So these different teachers along the way were all guides from my soul, my being, to wake itself up in this form.
And so there was one person in particular who kind of recognized your level of consciousness and suggested that you claim it. And after that, there was a real shift.
Yeah, he told me repetitively that all I needed to do was claim the fact that I was awake, which I did. And that sort of started the spiritual journey, the 6 and 7 chakras opening up again and connecting with myself as a being. So that's opened up that part of the journey. And the other part of it was the diamond approach, which was a wonderful technique which sort of advanced psychoanalysis to include the body and the soul and spirit in a speaking and unfoldment process. So having a witness and speaking out the consciousness that emerged. So that the primary technique of the diamond approach is
one of your main practices.
Yeah, it's one of my main practices.
But before that, before we entered the school of the diamond approach, which we were in for about 4 years until we left, before that, we found a Kundalini master.
Yeah, Swamiji. Yeah, who we did very intense spiritual practices to reroute the energy in the body from a blocked process of not being able to get to the 7th chakra to reconnect. And so there was a movement there which was positive. And so there was moments of recognition, moments of expansion, moments of spiritual waking enlightenment, but not permanence like I have now. Now there's permanent access to all these spiritual levels, many of them that are subtle. And I recognize them when they're spoken to me or read to me or when I read them.
Well, we learned a lot about the Kundalini from Swamiji and his US teacher, Joan Harrigan, and her book, Kundalini Vidya. And one of the things we learned is that there are a limited number of ways that the Kundalini rises. And in each of those risings, there are very specific blocks where the Kundalini gets locked and stops people from waking up. So you had this experience that their practices really kind of unlocked the blocks for you. And you began to have some direct perceptions You began to have really clear witnessing. You had, you know, there were a lot of openings there.
Right. But in essence, I was awake before this lifetime. And in essence, consciousness was acting through my soul in unfolding this development of opening up the energy flow and the moving through the chakras, moving through the energy centers, and developing the higher, the heart, the throat, the psychic perception, which continues. So there's a sort of a pyramid process where the base chakra, the bottom chakra, the what's it called?
Root, Muladhara.
Muladhara, yes. Muladhara chakra keeps opening up and allows the other chakras to form as a pyramid. So you get higher and higher, but the base needs to be more solid and more solid and more solid. So, you know, so there's still continuous development of the body, the emotions, the thoughts, the beliefs, the attitudes, the connection with compassion, with humanity, the planet, as the higher levels of being and awareness and divinity and emptiness and oneness open further.
So I would say that, you know, we went to India to see this Kundalini teacher, and he was living a life like your past life, right? He was living the life of a sadhu.
He was a monk.
And totally focused on his practices,
Mm-hmm.
no relationships, no money, and so on. And it was an interesting reflection for the difference in the path that you've taken to become embodied and to develop the full range of being human. We saw some shadow issues in him because of his lack of development in certain lower chakras. That was really interesting. So these days, what is your practice and what is your experience like?
Well, in some ways, what we're doing here is my practice. So speaking out the truth and watching it unfold. And meditating is a practice, inquiry is still a practice. And life is a practice. So my general experience is that everything that's happened in my life and in your life, it leads you to more consciousness. It's sort of like opening the doors so that the divine can manifest itself in human form and experience itself from that aspect of awareness. So the divine is both inside of this being and outside of this being at the same time, so that there's a dual process that allows it to experience itself. And that continues to unfold in very interesting ways.
So life is your curriculum, you could say.
Or
like Ram Dass says, it's all grist for the mill.
Right. Well, it's guided not by me, by the universe, by the cosmos, which sends teachers, which sends guides, which opens one up to life experience. And, you know, some of them are important, like the first marriage, like the immigration, very important. Learning to detach from a culture and being embodied in a new culture. So experiencing the transitions, loving people in my life, my wife, my kids, my grandkids. The beauty of psychotherapy as a spiritual path and the way it opens up certain chakras. So it's all a guide from the inside and continues to grow.
So let's ask our listeners to just contemplate this experience of yours and mine, which is that life itself is the teacher. And we can create the circumstances for the evolution of consciousness in the circumstances of our lives.
Correct.
In what shows up, in who shows up, and how we respond to it. It's all our curriculum. And we did do a podcast on aging into awakening through the lifespan, if that interests you.
Mhm.
Okay, shall we land here?
Sounds great.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you found our discussion insightful, there's a good chance your friends will too. And we'd love it if you could take a moment to share this episode with a friend who you believe would appreciate it. Help us spread the word and reach more people. And follow us on any platform. Turn on your episode notifications so you never miss new content. Thanks for being part of our podcasting journey.